The end did not come on the battlefield. It came in a tent, under the guise of a peace parley that was nothing more than a funeral rite for his dignity. The Parthian general, Surina, knew exactly who Crassus was. He knew of the greed that fueled the Roman's heart. He didn't just want to kill Crassus. He wanted to perform a piece of cosmic theater. He wanted to close the ledger. According to the darkest whispers of history, Crassus was executed with a poetic cruelty that borders on the divine. They didn't use a sword. They didn't use a rope. They took the one thing he loved most. They took the gold. They melted it down in a crucible until it was a white-hot, viscous liquid. They forced his mouth open, the mouth that had dictated the terms of 1,000 ruinous contracts, and they poured the molten gold down his throat. Sate thyself, they mocked, with the metal of which thou art so greedy. Imagine the final seconds. The searing heat, the smell of charred flesh, the absolute finality of the metal hardening inside his chest. In those last moments, Crassus finally achieved his dream. He and his gold became one. He became a statue of his own vice. But the humiliation wasn't over. His head was cut off and sent to the Parthian king. It arrived during a performance of Euripides' play, the Bacchae. The actors took the real head of Crassus and used it as a prop, the head of a king torn apart by his own madness. The richest man in Rome ended as a piece of dinner theater for his enemies. His body was never returned. His gold was scattered. His family line withered. The empire he built on the ashes of others was blown away by the desert wind, leaving nothing but a name that serves as a warning. We live in an age of Crassuses. We see them in high-rise offices, in the flickering glow of stock tickers, in the eyes of those who believe that enough is a number that doesn't exist. They think the delay in justice is the same as the absence of justice. But the ghost of Crassus whispers a different truth from the sands of Parthia. He tells us that you can spend your life filling your coffers, you can spend your years ignoring the cries of the scorched, and you can build walls of silver to keep out the truth. But the debt always finds a way home. The gold you hoard today is the weight that will drown you tomorrow. Because in the end, we are not judged by what we gathered. We are judged by what we broke to get. The desert of Mesopotamia does not care about your bank balance. In the year 53 BC, the Roman war machine ground to a halt in the blinding heat of Carrhae. Crassus, the man of ledgers and logic, found himself in a world where logic had no currency. He was facing the Parthians, a ghost army of horse archers who moved like the wind and struck like a fever. The reversal didn't happen with a grand explosion. It happened with a small, forgotten detail from his youth: arrogance. Crassus had always assumed that every man had a price and every problem had a technical solution. He treated the invasion like a real estate acquisition. He moved his men in a massive, rigid square, thinking that sheer mass would prevail. But the Parthians utilized a feigned retreat, drawing the Romans deeper into the burning waste. Then the arrows began. They weren't ordinary arrows. They were heavy, steel-tipped bolts launched from composite bows that could pierce Roman shields and pin a legionnaire's hand to his own face. For hours, the Romans stood in the sun, dying in silence. Crassus waited for the Parthians to run out of ammunition. He calculated the odds. He looked at the horizon, waiting for the moment their quivers would be empty so he could counterattack. This was his ledger mindset, input versus output. But then he saw it. In the distance, a train of thousands of camels, laden with replacement arrows. The Parthians had an infinite supply. In that moment, the mask slipped. The man who had spent his life ensuring he had more than everyone else was suddenly faced with an enemy that had more than him. More mobility, more range, more patience. His son, Publius, the light of his life, the heir to his vast, blood-soaked fortune, led a desperate charge to break the encirclement. Crassus watched from a distance, praying to gods he hadn't spoken to in years. A few hours later, a Parthian rider approached the Roman lines. He wasn't carrying a white flag. He was carrying a spear. At the tip of that spear was the head of Publius Crassus. The richest man in Rome looked into the dead eyes of his own legacy and realized that all the gold in the world could not buy back a single second of his son's life. The buildings he had stolen, the widows he had cheated, the fires he had watched, they all came rushing back in the form of that severed head. The Roman army collapsed. Not because they were weak, but because their leader was hollow. The man who had lived for the self found that when the self is broken, there is nothing left to lead. Crassus fled into the night, a ghost in a purple cloak, wandering the sands. He was no longer a titan. He was a debtor, and the collection agents were closing in. Decades passed. The screams of the fire victims faded into the low hum of high society. Crassus was no longer a vulture, he was a titan. He sat at the pinnacle of the first triumvirate, flanked by the military genius of Pompey and the rising charisma of Julius Caesar. In this unholy trinity, Crassus was the gravity. He didn't need the love of the masses or the medals of the battlefield. He had the debt of every senator in Rome in his pocket. This is the harvest, the long, golden autumn of a villain's life. For 10, 20, 30 years, Crassus lived in the silence of his victory. He walked through the forum and the crowds parted like the Red Sea. He dined on peacock tongues and drank wine cooled by snow brought from the mountains. His villas were so numerous he likely forgot the names of the slaves who tended them. There is a psychological horror in this phase of the story. We want the villain to suffer immediately. We want the lightning bolt to strike the moment the crime is committed. But in the real world, the wicked often thrive. Crassus grew old in luxury. He saw his sons grow into powerful men. He saw his influence permeate every brick of Rome. He felt a sense of profound impunity. The laws of men were things he bought. The laws of gods were things he ignored. He began to believe his own myth, that gold was not just a tool but a shield that could stop even the march of time. But there was a hollow space in his chest, a hunger that gold could not fill. You see, Pompey had his greatness. Caesar had his Gauls. They had glory, the kind of immortality that isn't measured in coins but in echoes. Crassus, despite all his billions, was seen by the Roman psyche as a tradesman, a glorified accountant. The elite looked at him and saw the soot of the fire still under his fingernails. He wanted a triumph. He wanted the red paint on his face and the laurel on his brow. He wanted to be a god of war. At the age of 60, when most men are looking toward the hearth and the legacy of their grandchildren, Crassus looked east, toward Parthia. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the land. He needed the one thing his gold couldn't buy, the respect of history. He set out with 7 legions. He ignored the omens. He ignored the warnings of his advisors. He even ignored the screams of a man in the Roman streets who cursed him as he left the city gates. Crassus laughed. He was the richest man in Rome. He had bought everything else. Surely he could buy victory. He was marching into the harvest of his own soul. The victims of 30 years ago were long dead, but the weight of their stolen lives was finally beginning to pull on the scales. The silence of the victims was about to be replaced by the whistling of Parthian arrows. The soil of Rome has always been thirsty. Usually, it drinks the blood of soldiers or the sweat of slaves. But for Marcus Licinius Crassus, the soil was merely a ledger. To understand the rot, we must look at the seed. Rome was screaming. The civil wars of Sulla had turned the streets into a slaughterhouse. Proscription lists were nailed to the forum, names of men declared enemies of the state. To have your name on that list was a death sentence. To have your neighbor's name on that list was an opportunity. While others trembled, Crassus calculated. He did not see a city in agony. He saw a liquidation sale. He followed the executioners like a vulture following a plague. As the enemies of Sulla were dragged to the Tiber, their estates, vast vineyards, marble villas, ancestral legacies, were seized. Crassus was there at the auctions, the only man with the stomach and the silver to buy. He purchased the lives of the fallen for pennies, turning the grief of widows into the foundation of his empire. But his true masterpiece of cruelty was the fire. Rome was a tinderbox, timber framed instantly huddled together in the heat. When a fire broke out, and they always did, the city held its breath. But Crassus did not hold his breath. He held a contract. He organized a private fire brigade of 500 slaves. When a building ignited, Crassus would arrive while the flames were still licking the rafters. He would stand before the frantic owner, the heat reddening his face, and offer to buy the burning property on the spot. If the owner refused, Crassus and his men would simply stand there. They would watch. They would wait as the roar of the fire consumed a lifetime of memories. Eventually the price would drop. It always dropped. Only after the deed was signed would the slaves begin to work. He owned the fire. He owned the water. He owned the ruin. There is a specific kind of darkness required to profit from a man's house while his children are still inside it. It is a cold, mathematical detachment. Crassus didn't hate the people he ruined. To him they weren't people at all. They were obstacles to a higher number. He amassed a fortune that defied comprehension, 200 million sesterces. He was the bank. He was the landlord. He was the shadow that fell over every transaction in the Republic. He had won. The seed of injustice had been planted in the scorched earth of his victims' homes. And as the years passed, it grew into a forest of gold, shielding him from the sun, making him feel untouchable. He believed he had cheated the gavel. He believed the ink of his contracts was stronger than the blood of his crimes. He was wrong. The debt was merely gathering interest. Imagine a man who owned the very air of Rome, and charged his neighbors for the privilege of breathing it. We are told that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. But for Marcus Licinius Crassus, that arc seemed to snap under the weight of his gold. He did not just escape the consequences of his cruelty, he built a palace out of them. He watched his victims burn, then bought the ashes for a pittance. He grew old, fat, and powerful while the ghosts of the exploited screamed into a void that offered no echo. Does it anger you? It should. Because for decades, Crassus proved that if you are rich enough, the gods themselves can be put on the payroll. But time is a creditor that refuses to be bribed. And when the bill finally came due for the richest man in Rome, it wasn't paid in coin. It was paid in molten liquid and the hollow silence of a desert grave. This is not a success story. This is the anatomy of a debt, and the terrifying precision with which it was finally collected.